So evidence-based reading, what is that? In the past, it was just called reading. Now it's called evidence-based reading. Well, the first thing is, what they're saying here is there is actually evidence that you will have to find within the reading passage in order to answer the questions. The other thing you need to worry about with evidence-based reading, or not worry about so much, but you need to be aware of, is your attitude going into the evidence-based reading. Attitude for reading is everything. We say attitude is everything, fake it till you ace it. And what we mean by that is this. This is not going to be fascinating, interesting, engaging reading. This is going to be dry and possibly make your eyes feel like they need to roll back into your head because there's not a lot of interest in what you're reading. And how many times have you been reading something and 10 minutes in you're like, I don't even know what I just read? Well, we can't afford to do that on a timed PSAT. So you have to walk into the reading knowing that this is going to be the best, most fascinating, engaged read you have ever had in your life, okay? For that 60 minutes, you are locked in on reading. And once you establish that attitude, you will have a much better evidence-based reading score than if you walk in and like, ugh, this is going to be horribly painful. I just can't wait for it to be over. I wish I never had to do this. And let's face it, none of us are super excited about having to do a PSAT. I'm sure you weren't like, woohoo, I get to spend my time watching some woman talk about PSAT today. But it is, in fact, an element to success. So let's make the best of it and get the best score you can. So my little friend Sherlock Holmes over here. I'm sure all of y'all are familiar with Sherlock Holmes. Your Sherlock Holmes may be a little more current than mine is. But in the end, they still do the same thing. They're looking for evidence. They're an investigator and they're looking for evidence. Well, that's what you in fact are doing as you're doing evidence-based reading for the PSAT. I just told you it is 60 minutes of exciting reading, 5 passages. 1 passage will be from U.S. and world literature. It's a total of 9 questions. History and social studies will be 2 passages, each of those passages 9 to 10 questions each. We also have 2 science passages, again, they're 9 to 10 questions each. Of the 2 history, social studies, and science passages, I know that sounds like 6, but it really is only 4. One of those 4 passages will be what we refer to as that paired passage. And what that means is there's a passage 1 and a passage 2 within the passage, so to speak, and you'll cross-reference those 2 to answer some questions. It's a total of 47 questions over 60 minutes. It doesn't sound bad, but you have to read and answer the questions in those 47 minutes. It's doable, especially when you know the strategies to do it within that time. So let's look at the types of questions that you're going to see on reading. Now, I think we've all established that if you're sitting here ready to take a PSAT, you are in fact more than capable of reading these slides on your own. So I am not going to read these word for word. But what I do want to point out is here, you want to go ahead and tick off anything that you're not completely familiar with or have a complete understanding of. Because it's very beneficial when you know how you're being tested to study for that. And this is, in fact, how you're going to be tested. These are the types of questions that you'll see in the test. So let's look at analyzing quantitative information really quickly. Quantitative means that it is, in fact, measurable with a number. So that's what you want to keep in mind for that quantitative. You're used to reading closely, determining explicit meaning, don't play in the street, versus implicit meaning, stay away from traffic. And all of those things I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with, but if you're not comfortably familiar with them, then you want to go and spend a little bit of time familiarizing yourself with these so that when you are tested on them, you know what you're being tested on. So, next slide. Key differences in new and old PSAT reading. So, your former PSAT was more definition-oriented for words. Kind of like New York Times crossword puzzle sort of words that you never used. And going forward, it's going to be more words in context versus definitions. There is more of an emphasis on the evidence instead of the critical reasoning skill that you used to use in former PSAT, and SAT for that matter. Now there is this thing called inclusion of informational graphics. Does that sound exciting? It's not really exciting, but what it means is you will actually have graphics that are embedded within your writing and language and your reading sections. Those graphics are put in there so that they can ascertain that cross-test score for science and history. And then you also have a larger range of text complexity. So a few different things. Overall, it's kind of the same, just a few different emphasis. So let's look at this slide. As you can see, you have a color change here. And this is probably one of those slides that you have a significant blank in. These are our strategy slides. These are the slides that are really going to help you manage the test. So our first strategy is scan questions for line references and mark them in the passage with a single line, but not brackets. And we'll talk about why not brackets a little bit later on when we get to the importance of brackets. So what we're telling you is that when you're reading, you will have questions that actually have line references that take you to a particular place in the passage. And we want you to go ahead and find those questions with line references and mark the line references in the passage associated with the question. That's going to help you to read and answer simultaneously. The questions are always in order of the passage. So I'm going to say that again a little more explicitly. We don't want you to read the passage, answer the questions. We don't want you to read the questions, read the passage. We want you to do them at the same time. So read a couple of paragraphs, answer a couple of questions. You always want to read the conclusion at the very beginning though, so you have an overall feel for the tone of the paragraph, or the passage, I should say. So I just said that again. Read a couple of paragraphs in the last few sentences, and then answer as many questions as you can. Go on and read a little bit more, answer a few more questions, and just keep doing that until you've answered all the questions for the passage and move on to the next passage. So this is what it looks like. So we have our reading section on one side and our questions on the other side. And as you can see, this particular question does in fact have line references of 69 to 73. So we just drew a little line over there to indicate those line references, and then we looked at all of our other questions to see if they in fact had line references, and we'd go ahead and mark any other line references that were noted before we started answering our questions. Pretty self-explanatory. All right, so paired questions. So some questions on the new PSAT and SAT are followed by a question. Which choice provides evidence for the previous question? There's that evidence word again. So first of all, you want to scan ahead and see if you have any of these questions related to the passage that you're working on. And then you want to use line references to help you know where to look for the answer. Now these are going to be a little more marked than just the typical line reference. And then you're going to answer both questions simultaneously. I'm going to show you an example of what we're talking about on this next slide. But what we really want you to do when you find a question that's specific to that and it's answering a question for another question, you actually want to do the question and the answer selection letter with it. So it's going to look like this. So question 4 is just a straight question, but question 5 is the question about the question, so to speak. So we have those line references, and we've marked it 5A, 5B, 5C, and 5D. And again, you want to look ahead to see if you have any of these paired questions associated with your passage. And if you do, then you want to go ahead and do this before you really start answering your questions. So let's look at this strategy. This is a great strategy. This might even be a retweet opportunity because I know y'all have your phones. I have a 16-year-old too. You're never far from your phones. So feel free to share this tip. It's a good one. You want to avoid answer choices that are extreme. Now, there may be the rare occasion where you come across an extreme passage in a PSAT or an SAT, but for the most part, they're pretty moderate in tone. So you want to stay away from anything that kind of ends in an EST. Let's look at our examples right here. Egyptians used the most gold of any civilization in history. Can we really prove that? That's kind of a thought, but not necessarily anything that we could find hard evidence to support. So we want to stay away from EST, and we want to stay away from words that are like absolute in their nature. Most, least, never, always. Let's look at the next one. Genghis Khan was the cruelest ruler of all time. Well, I may in fact believe that Genghis Khan was the cruelest ruler of all time. You, however, may think that your third grade teacher was the cruelest ruler of all time. So it's extreme in its statement, and we want to avoid those types of answers. The other thing is we want to avoid answers that involve money. Unless our passage that we're reading about has something to do with money, our answers won't involve money. So you want to stay away from answer choices that have expensive or monetary values associated with them. You want to stay away from answer choices that are your opinion. Remember, this is evidence-based reading. The other thing is we want to stay away from comparison answers unless we're in that double passage or the author has actually compared something within the passage. So you're looking for those keywords of more or less or fewer or greater within the answers, and those can help you eliminate some answers. I'm going to go back to that slide really quickly just to make sure everybody got those filled in their blanks. I know, I can go kind of fast sometimes. All right, let's go on to our next strategy. So, when to guess. The great news is you can guess now without a penalty, and that is fabulous. But you need to know how to guess to make it work to your best advantage. So first of all, we're in evidence-based reading. So the reality is the evidence for all of the answers are in fact in the passage. However, if this was easy, you wouldn't be spending a few hours with me. Sometimes it's not exactly Captain Obvious to the rescue. So what we need to do is we need to match the tone of the passage with our answer choice. And if we're still not sure of what our answer choice should be, then we always want to keep in mind that SAT and PSAT are always politically correct for the most part, and will often be very moderate in tone. So if we're still trying to decide between two potential answer selections, then always go ahead if you're unsure and go with the more moderate of the two, more moderately toned of the two answer choices. Just a little way to kind of up your score, so to speak, with the guessing option. So we talked about those graphics that are being inserted into the test in different places to help give you those cross-section scores for college indicators on history and science. That's what this is going to look like, your reading graphics. You'll have 2 questions per graphic, and it can be a general or it can be a specific question to the graphic itself. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is if the graphic shows up in reading, or if the graph really shows up in reading, then you have to really pay attention to what you're reading and to the graph, because some answer choices will be accurate according to the graph on its own, but not responsive to the question in association with the passage reading. So they have to be, in fact, true for both sides. And it looks like this. It's not anything fancy or special. You just have a part of the passage right here. Then you have the questions associated that you need to use the graph and the passage to answer. Everybody good there? I know, it's really exciting, isn't it? Okay. Let's look at strategy paired passage. So paired passage is that last passage that it's 2 passages in one section, so to speak. So here's how you approach a paired passage. You want to read the introduction. Oop, my text isn't coming out. You want to read the introduction, material for perspective. You want to scan your questions for line references. You want to mark those in both passages and make them a little bit different so you can recognize the difference. Then read passage 1 and answer questions from passage 1. Read passage 2, answer questions from passage 2. What's left over will be comparison questions between the 2 passages. So much like how do you eat an elephant, 1 bite at a time, in case you didn't know, that's how you tackle a paired passage, 1 passage at a time. So we've tackled pair passages, we've tackled line references, we've tackled evidence in and of itself, and we've tackled how to utilize the chart within reading. So let's tackle a practice test.